continue our talks today. We still have a lot of lectures today, but from tomorrow on, we will work a bit more hands-on and exchange each other's thoughts and projects. I'm really happy to introduce Carlo DiSalvo. I got to know your work through the Neighborhood Networks project, which is some time ago. Now you write a lot more about participatory design, especially your book Adversarial Design is also really interesting, talking about how design can be political. And in the reader we see an extension of that work, but you're going to talk about something different from that also today. So yeah, I'll give the floor to you then.
Great, thanks. So I'm about to do something that's either really interesting or really stupid, which is to present entirely new work for the first time in this context, and to do so with jet lag. So we'll see how this goes. So my interest has been for a long while trying to understand and really to think about, in terms of being a design researcher and a design critic, as well as a practicing designer, but more from the scholarly angles, how to wrestle with the social and political qualities and potentials of design. So in many ways, adversarial design was a way to wrestle with that, which was a way to think about how design can do the work of agonism and really open up the space for what we mean by the political in regards to design. And what I'm interested in wrestling with now, what I want to begin to do so today, is to really think about this relationship between design and the social. Because I would argue, really building off of Palla's talk yesterday, he had these four sort of periods of design, and that we're entering a new period, a fourth period, this sort of period after a discussion of design things. And I would argue that really what we're entering is another social turn in design. Not the first social turn in design, but another social turn in design. The challenge is really to understand what that means. So there's a very simple premise to all of this work. And that premise is that in the 21st century, one of the things that design does is it makes the social. Right? That making the social is an endeavor of design. And then one of the challenges for us as designers and design scholars and critics or people interested in design is to actually be able to come to critically appreciate what that means to make the social. So let me give you, begin by giving you a sense of the context, the kinds of things that I'm interested in. So this is an image from a project called Parking Day. Are people familiar with Parking Day? So Parking Day to me is this amazing example of what we can think of as social design. So the way that Parking Day works is that one day a year, people take over parking spaces in cities and they turn them into spaces for something else. Often spaces that are not occupied by cars, spaces in which people make use of that context for something else. And so here you see a parking space in San Francisco that's been taken over, and some grass has been put down. We don't know if it's artificial grass or real grass, and a couple of benches, and actually a parking space has been effectively occupied. So what's fascinating to me about this is to think about this as a social design activity and to think about what's actually going on here. Because what we see in this action is not the creation of new forms or structures in the ways that we would commonly think about them, but rather the creation of a possibility of reconfiguring social and material relations. But what's important about this too is that it's not permanent. Right? This isn't a proposal to actually rezone the street. This isn't digging up this part of the street and actually turning it into something else. It's a design act that is contingent, that is hesitant, that is partial, that is temporary, that this is its fulfillment, is in this moment, not actually in achieving some sort of larger change. Meaning not actually in petitioning for San Francisco or Atlanta or whatever city to change this ordinance, but to actually just to temporarily reconfigure what that space and our experience of that space might be like. And in the process, we can think about what this means as a sort of design act and what is created, what is the designer doing, What is the engagement with the city? I would argue that this is a very technological engagement with the city. Not that there's computers involved, but that there's an understanding of the technologies of the city, the ways in which, for example, parking meters work, the ways in which zoning works. It's a kind of social engagement that requires people to show up and participate in order to make it happen. And in that participation, different kinds of social relationships have to be negotiated. So when this happens in Atlanta, Atlanta is a very car-heavy city. It's not unusual for drivers to be throwing things at you, to be yelling at you. This isn't something that we just do and everyone says, oh, that's great, you took my parking space for the day. I'm happy, go about imagining your different world. Rather, it's a very fraught situation. So this is the kind of social context that I'm really interested in exploring and trying to understand if this is making the social, what is really happening here? So I want to be clear, I'm not claiming to be the first to say that design is involved in making the social. In fact, that many people have said that. Really the questions that I'm interested in as we probe this are, if design is an act of making a social, then what are the characteristics of this social made? How do we describe it? How do we appreciate it? How do we critique it? And then for what ends is the social made? So my interest is not being the first to make a claim that this is happening. Others have done that. Nor is my interest actually to provide a handbook. This isn't a methods lecture. But rather to sort of explore the qualities and purposes writ large of how design is involved in making the social. So if we take this as a starting point, this opens up all sorts of other questions, right, that you could begin to ask. You could begin to ask, what is the social? How do we articulate and critically appreciate this practice? What are the factors and potentials and limits? And really, as we begin to move through this, begin to say, if the starting question is that, or the starting claim is that design is making the social, maybe there's a way in which the social is also making design. Maybe what we're seeing now is a way in which design and whatever the social is are mutually constitutive. They're actually making one another. So this is a big project. It's more than we can talk about in an hour this morning. So what I really want to do is just start down this route and begin by looking at three things. So what I wanted to talk about over the next hour or so is come up with 5 defining themes and 3 questions for making, and those 3 questions for making will end up getting us back to this discussion that's important to us here about the changing qualities of participation and work in design. So when we think about design and the social, there's 2 contexts in which this often comes up. The first is social design, and the second is social technologies. So what we're going to do is talk about them in that order and sort of probe the ways in which these two fields play off of each other and really give us insight into what it is to be involved in making the social. And my argument from a starting point is that whatever this notion of social design is, it's not a singular thing. So when we hear about a social design conference or a social design reader, right, this is not a way of thinking about design the same way that architecture or interaction or industrial or graphic or even perhaps participatory design is a way of thinking about it. So rather than understanding social design as a singular or coherent practice, what I want to argue is that social design is in fact a series of these themes that define it. And to understand social design is to really trace out what these themes are. So, where to start? It's not that design is newly social. We could argue that the history of modern design as we know it has always been involved in being social and the idea of creating objects that shape our relations with one another. Rather, what I would say, though, is over the last 50 years, we have seen and we're building towards another social turn in which this idea of the social comes to the fore. It becomes the purpose and product of design. Not a byproduct of design, not simply a context in which design works, right? Not a way in which we say the social is equated with the notion of the good, or the social is some sort of context other than work, but rather wrestling with whatever the social is itself the activity of design. if we look at how social design has been construed by designers and design theorists, we can begin to draw out some of these themes. So, like Pelle did yesterday, I want to present a bit of a history. It will be interesting to see how our histories weave together, which they do, but they also start and end in different places. So whenever we're talking about social design, right, the place to start with this really is Victor Papanek's design for the real world, human ecology, and social change. So how many people are familiar with Victor Papanek, right? Some. So Victor Papanek, right, is an iconoclast, and he's perhaps best known. A few people have actually gone through all of this, but he's probably best known for his opening line, "There are professions more harmful than industrial design, but only a few." And what Papanek really does is he begins to set up this discussion about what it might be to practice a different kind of design. It's important to note that in his discussion, what he does is he splits design and he splits the book into two sections. The first section is called How It Is, and it has chapter titles such as The Myth of the Noble Slav and Do-It-Yourself Murder. And then he has chapter titles such as he has the section How It Could Be, with chapter titles that include things like Rebel with a Cause and Design Responsibility. So Papanek is really setting up oppositions between practices of design, or rather that's the way his work gets interpreted later on, between professionalized practices of design that are completely woven in with industry and other forms of design. And if you actually if you get into his text, this is a copy of a book that I actually found, and he has these very polemical lines. Design is a problem-solving activity. This kowtowing to the lowest common denominator has no reason for existence. It's only when the designer abrogates his responsibility to himself and others that he operates as a pimp for the sales department that he finds the creation of warmed-over soul food palatable at all. So Papanek is really setting up an oppositional stance here around what the different kinds of design can be. Before going off of Papanek, but he sets the tone. He sets the tone for discussion around social design that continues today. So before going on, one of the interesting things to note about Papanek is actually the subtitle of the book, Human Ecology and Social Change. I would say that subtitle is in fact as important as the title itself. It calls out three factors that we have to wrestle with in a continuing history of social design. Right? The first is the character of our environment. What's our environment? For Papanek, it's an ecology. It's not any other kind of system. It's very specifically an ecology. It's a series of entities that have interrelationships with one another. And understanding how to do design for the real world is understanding this notion of an ecology. It's also a human ecology. This may be a reflection of discourses at the time, but it's still worth pointing out that that's the framework in which we're presented this idea. And the purpose of this is very explicit. The purpose of this is social change. So what we get with Papanek is this introduction, discussion of what we're doing with social design, which is put in opposition with other kinds of design, mostly market-driven design, and put in a context of an ecology and a human ecology. And Papanek really sets the tone for a lot of the discussion that continues on today. So if we keep moving forward in time, when we go from Papanek as one cornerstone text to another cornerstone text, which is an essay by Sylvia and Victor Margolin entitled A Social Model of Design, Issues of Practice and Research. So Sylvia and Victor Margolin propose a model of social design that's based upon social work. And they very explicitly come out and say this social design can model itself off of the idea of social work, following similar processes and methods, following similar ways of problem discovery, addressing problems, and then importantly for them, problem evaluation. One of the things that's notable about Sylvia and Victor Margolin's work is that they actually begin by taking issue with Papanek and with the tension between social design and more familiar modes of market-driven design. So as Papanek sets these against each other, Margolin and Margolin really resist such a clean distinction. And they state, by harshly criticizing the market economy, Papanek limits options for social design. And what Margolin and Margolin begin to do is begin to argue, how can we think about this idea of a socially engaged, politically charged design that takes place not in opposition, or not in essential opposition to the market, but somehow integrated within it operating as a force of change. We still have a similar notion of change that happens in the Margolin's proposal, but change that doesn't require a radical break from design. It's interesting to note that Margolin and Margolin also end up having an ecological view. They call upon environmental psychology to frame their perspective of design. So while Papanek calls it human ecology, the Margolins call upon environmental psychology as the model for how to think about this. If we keep moving forward in time, these discussions continue to happen around, for example, how to structure the practices and processes of social design. And Nicola Morelli begins to offer some ideas in a series of articles about asking questions about, can you industrialize social design? And begins to ask questions, explicitly picks up on both Papanek and the Margolins and pushes it forwards in new directions, and begins to actually ask questions about what are the ways in which we might not oppose, not destroy, but actually make use of the existing structures of capital and globalization in order to achieve our social goals. So, for example, Morelli offers that, he says, the possible convergences between industrial logistics, offers that possible convergences between industrial logistics and social instances may in fact provide us the basis for doing social design at scale. So the interest that he ends up developing is saying, how can we do this and how can we piggyback on logistics and infrastructure mechanisms, the very mechanisms of globalization that we often critique, how can we use those as models to move at scale around the idea of what social design might be? And so we see a progressive complication of the relationship between design and industry. We also see a progressive opening up of what the field of design is actually concerned with. So for Papanek, and again, this is not at all a critique of Papanek, it's sort of a historical situation where Papanek's interest has a much tighter coupling to the object, for example, than we get in Morelli, who decades later is opening us up and asking us to think about interfaces and interactions with logistics systems as the objects and activities of design. So this continues forward, and one example of this, another example of this actually, is the work of Ezio Manzini and Manzini's notions around collaborative services. So Manzini continues to develop this idea. Manzini is also interested in this notion about how do we think larger scale than individual products, how do we begin to think about the ways in which we collaborate around service development. And Manzini develops a whole series of projects around this, which are collected in the Collaborative Services book, and a series of labs, and really begins to ask questions. So what does it mean, for example, if we address activities such as laundry as a collective activity, and how do we think about those sorts of services that we might build up over time? Manzini now, what you see with Manzini is a continued engagement with this notion of design and industry, where in fact, almost with Manzini, you see an inversion of the previous relationship where Manzini is saying, no, we can industrialize, or we can systematize, or we can develop services ourselves that are collaborative and citizen-driven. Manzini also opens up the space really around the term social innovation more than many of the other earlier designers. And what Manzini does with social innovation that's important is he makes it so that our understanding of social innovation is not that we are innovating in the social realm, but rather the notion that the social itself is what's being innovated. So for Manzini, what we see is that design becomes a way to change the social. Right? The social is this context or this series of spaces in which we work and relations, and design becomes a way to contribute to innovation in that space. These may look familiar. Right. As Manzini is developing this, we have another parallel set of activities that are going on coming from the fields of participatory design, which we heard quite a little bit about yesterday, so I don't need to spend too much time with this. But really probing, again, the idea of what's the relationship between design and the social. In some ways engaging with Papanek's tradition, but in many other ways not. In many other ways engaging with another tradition that overlaps, but is not one and the same, but still is very much concerned with this notion of the social. So we get the idea of design things as these socio-material assemblages drawing off of the work of Latour, around which we gather to express and engage issues, to express and engage matters of concern. And we see that being developed into this idea of making futures in which what designers are doing is, in ways that I would argue are very similar to what we saw with rebar, not proposing these finalized situations, but proposing these tentative experiments into what the conditions of the social might be. It's actually in this field, and I think what's most interesting is it's in the young designers that are coming out of this field that we see this being pushed even farther, that we see some of the assumptions that we had about earlier notions of the context being broadened. And so one example of that is the work of Lee Janssen's dissertation work, which explored a non-anthropocentric framework in design, which begins to ask questions about what if the context of the social, for example, isn't a human ecology? What if the context of the social is an ecology that includes non-humans as well? And how do we begin to design for that? And how do we begin to open the space of what that might be? And how do we begin to think about things beyond the notion of the product or the service, and in fact begin to question the social as a space of an event? And so Lee does, together with a colleague, does some fantastic work, for example, about exploring the ways in which we might think about birds and elders living together in housing and in the city, and the ways in which they might be co-creative, and opens up this space for us to imagine and play in and explore a kind of social design that's not so much about a human ecology, but about a much broader ecology. And that really splits from past notions of what the definition in the context of the social is. So if we look across these just very few projects, right, and this short history, I would argue we can begin to call out a series of themes that give shape to whatever it is that we're talking about when we talk about social design. And it's these themes, I would argue it's actually these themes that define what the practice of the social is more than any other activity. So the first theme is an ongoing exploration of the relationship of design to business and more broadly capitalism. Throughout the last 50, 60 years of social design, this is a consistent theme, right? And in some ways, this theme is always going to be there because the nature of capitalism is that it is itself changing. So it's not a critique. We don't need to actually necessarily critique Papanek for his position X number of decades ago, but rather understand that, in fact, in many ways, the world of capitalism, the world of market that he was talking about then is different than the one that we see today. So of course, this is not going to be a settled perspective. Of course, this is going to be an ongoing debate that shapes this practice, because the nature of business and the nature of capitalism itself is ongoing. So a second, what we see is an ongoing move towards relational and processual concepts to describe the practices and products of design. You see this move away over time from the singular object to thinking about things like logistics, to moving to things like collaborative services, to going into the space of design things and events where a systematic progression away from, but not divorcing oneself from, but a broadening to be more than the object. And then the final thing is that actually you see this ongoing search to characterize the social itself. Right? Part of whatever social design is, part of whatever using design as a practice of making the social, is recognizing that that term is not settled, that that term constantly gets reinvented. And part of what design is involved in is exploring the reinvention of what that is. Is it an ecology? Is it an environment? Is it an event? These three themes taken together give shape to what that practice is and begin to allow us to understand what it might mean to be engaged in the design practice of making the social. So, social design is one frame in which to look at this. The other frame that I want to look at this from is the perspective of social technologies. So some people say, why be concerned with social technologies? This is going to sound deterministic, and then we can argue this, but I actually think you can't think or do the social outside of a technological frame in the 21st century. Right? It's not necessarily, I'm not advocating for that. I'm saying that social technologies writ large have worked to reconstitute what we understand as the social. So understanding the ways in which these technologies are being developed is crucial to understanding whatever it is we mean by design engaging in the practice of making the social. And by social technologies, I think I want to begin with the obvious and say that, so this is usually what we mean by this. And in fact, this is the core of our experience with social technologies. But as we'll see, the story I want to tell is that social technologies start from a very different place and are getting much broader than this notion of just social media alone. So thinking about social technologies is worthwhile because, in fact, what we can do with this is also trace a history of social technologies that show us the ways in which that's changing. This is a great, I love this image. This is because there's many pictures of my friends in here when they were young and had hair. This is a project called Portholes, which was done by Xerox PARC decades ago. And the idea with portholes was that it was an early social technology in which you'd be able to fire up an application and it would have video streams, right? Very small, maybe, these were like 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters video streams of you and all of your coworkers remotely spread around the world, the world. And the idea was that it would create, that this social technology, the purpose of this social technology was to use video to create a sense of co-presence that reproduced as closely as possible the co-presence of being in the same room. This is an important fact. Early social technologies were very much about reproducing our common forms of social engagement. So questions of fidelity became important, right? You would find research papers that would say, hey, is it okay that this is grainy? Is it okay that this is black and white? If we include sound, is there more sociality that exists, right? Where the frame of reference was this idea of what we're doing now, right? That we'd all be in the same room together. And so this gives us an insight of what this was like. Now, it's funny if you, I was looking for a slide and I actually couldn't find one to show today because we have this now and it's chat roulette. And for any of you who have used chat roulette, it's basically nonstop pornography and masturbation. Right? So this is what we happen when we actually achieve these technologies. That's what we use it for. But we have it now. But we also have other sorts of ways in which this idea of streaming videos or sharing videos has changed. So now when we think about video sharing, we may think about something more like this. We may think about this idea in which it's not the fact that we're all co-present, but rather the fact that I can subscribe to something called a feed in which all of my friends are sharing these moments in their life or these things in their life that are stimulating them that they want me to know about. Right? It's a very different way of thinking about, if you think about this as a series of materialities, of computational capacities, how this is configured and how this is configured and the different kinds of sociality around them are fundamentally different. So what I want to argue is that what we begin to see with social technologies is a switch, a change, from the design of social technologies being about reproducing existing forms of sociality to instead social technologies, in fact, constituting new forms of sociality or togetherness, right? And this is perhaps the best example of that. This is a space in which I have things called friends, and I do things like liking them. And we have all sorts of relationships together, right, that actually do not mimic, right, the relationships that I have with these people or other people in the world. It constitutes a new notion of sociality. It doesn't reproduce something that already exists before. And it begins to complicate some of these questions, for example, about what am I actually doing here? Am I building, right? Are we building a relationship? When I chat with you on Facebook, are we building a relationship? When I post the link to the Traders site, are we building a relationship? Or am I in fact engaged, and this harkens back to yesterday's discussion, am I engaged in some sort of performance of myself, some sort of neoliberal labor in which I am having to promote myself? Am I engaged in some sort of affective labor when I do this, where I'm actually producing materials for Facebook? How is sociality being reconstituted in here, and how is it intermingling with ideas, for example, of labor in ways that it might not have before? This becomes an interesting design challenge for us, and one of the ways in which this gets talked about, Logan and Reimer talk about this in terms of the idea of collaborative media, and this is an image from their book, Collaborative Media. And what they argue that's interesting is that not only is notions of sociality changing here, but notions of design is changing here. So the argument that they would make is that, yes, there is a team that's involved in the design of this user interface, and yes, there is a team that's involved in the design of the various interactions around this, and yes, there's a team that's even involved in complicated things like thinking about how Facebook was going to handle it when I die. Right? But there's also a design practice that happens when I use it. That the designers of Facebook are not just those individuals sitting in the Facebook headquarters making the user interface, but the designer of Facebook is in fact myself. As I choose, as I like certain things, as I associate myself with bands or causes or events, the interface changes. The ways in which I'm interacting with this system changes. And you see this in social media throughout our individual experiences. You see this in things like Facebook, you see this in video streaming sites. And so their argument is that in fact what we're seeing in these social technologies is not just a redefinition of the social, but a redefinition of the moment of design, from design that happens before, right, to also design that happens afterwards, in use. Questioning of when is design time. Again, this isn't a new question. Right? The question of when is design time has been around for a while, particularly in PD, and we can talk to Pella about this, but when design happens. But one of the things that happens with social technologies is that there's a complication because the system is designing together with us. There are factors at work happening in these technologies that are structuring our experience of it, that are structuring the design, that are different than factors that happened in the past. And this produces actually a very complicated social environment. So we can take, for example, the movement of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter becomes a very complicated social environment, in part due to the way in which it moves through social technologies. So you have the development of a hashtag, and you have the development of a community, a black Twitter community, that in part rallies around this, and a larger community that rallies around this. Right? And it exists sort of in this way as a stream of tweets and associated media that we can respond to and view. And it becomes ever more complicated by the introduction of more and more voices that actually get intermingled together. So everyone from Conway West to whoever the hell Arthur Chu is, right? Become part of this discourse being shaped by this. And then the ability of people to interject media back into this, right? In fact, when photos like this are taken and introduced back into the stream of Black Lives Matter, and the way that then sparks actual protests in the streets, begins to complicate the ways in which we think about where is the social that's happening in these social technologies. And one of the arguments to be made is that it's not happening just with people alone, that it's happening also with the algorithm. So if we want to understand the ways in which social technologies are working, or the ways in which the social is constituted through these technologies, we have to also understand the ways in which the algorithm is working to do that. One of the best discussions around this is actually around Occupy Wall Street and the trending on Twitter. So Tarleton Gillespie is a media studies scholar who is very interested in understanding, he has a book coming out called The Politics of Platforms, and is very interested in understanding the ways in which algorithms govern. And you may or may not remember, but Occupy Wall Street was very active on Twitter, and Twitter and social media generally were a very important part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And several years ago, in the midst of Occupy, there was sort of a rumbling when the hashtag was not trending. So you would go onto Twitter, and all of these other things would be trending, but Occupy Wall Street was not trending. And the claim was made by some activists that this was censorship on the part of Twitter. That Twitter was looking at this and saying, this is material that we don't want to trend. So Gillespie looks into this and actually finds out that that is completely not the case. That in fact, the reason that Occupy Wall Street is not trending on Twitter has nothing to do with its popularity in the world outside of Twitter. It has to do with the Twitter algorithm. And it has to do with what Twitter considers to be something that's trending. And in fact, when something is flooded over time, which is what Occupy Wall Street did, it's the opposite. It doesn't trigger the trending algorithm. The activities on social media around Occupy Wall Street then were not actually, or the ways in which social media portrayed it, were not actually reflective of the practice in the world itself, nor was it reflective of a practice of censorship or guidance on the part of Twitter algorithm engineers or Twitter business people. It was actually the algorithm itself. To understand the ways in which Occupy moves across social media is in part necessary to understand the ways in which algorithms work. This situation is getting even more complicated as we move into a new world, right? A new world of the Internet of Things. So it's one situation when we're talking about media that we're commenting on, right, that we're producing data around and through. It becomes another situation in the conditions that we're entering into when every single one of our objects is also beginning to create data. When we have a situation in which we can arguably say that it's not only that we are being social through technology, but that technologies may be being social with one another. When a coffee cup knows what's happening in the coffee pot, when two cars driving down the road know what the other one is doing, when the road knows the condition of the car, these are states in which we have to begin to ask ourselves, are we also seeing a kind of sociality that's existing through objects? And how does that begin to complicate the matter? And at the bottom of all of this, it still comes back to that idea of the algorithm. And I found this to be both a horrifying and fascinating statement that I discovered on some social media marketing company's website. But a fascinating thing. So if relevancy is a kiss between two parties, then the algorithms that govern social media platforms are the matchmakers. And this challenges us to fundamentally think different about what we mean by the social and how we might intervene in making the social. So across these, I would say then you see two more themes, right? You see within social technologies a shift in the design experience of technologies from reproducing familiar modes of sociality to actually constituting entirely new modes. And you see an increasing awareness of the entwined capacities of human actions and algorithms to give form to dynamic situations. What Black Lives Matter is, as a social movement, is in part shaped by the algorithms that underlie those platforms. That is something that I think we have to wrestle with. So my argument is, if you take all five of these together, you don't, and for people typing, you don't have, like I'll give you the slides, you don't have to type. These are the themes, right? These are the defining themes, I think, of what it means to make the social in the 21st century. And it's not that we answer any of these. It's not that I can tell you how to do this, or that someone else is going to tell you how to do this, but that what we are engaged in is with wrestling and trying to move between and amongst these conditions. And that's the kind of work that we have to do. Whatever making the social is, happens in this space. Okay, so those are the 5 themes. I think from this, I've drawn out 3 sort of questions that we can ask ourselves as we think about now what do we do, right? So if these are 5 themes, then how do we begin to design within them? And some of this we've already heard, and so I think this will make for a fantastic conversation. The first question that we are asking ourselves is, what other modes are possible? If we go back to that question, and so to me this is a distillation of several of those other themes. It's a distillation of that theme about trying to understand the tension or the relationship between design and capitalism. It's also a way about thinking about that tension between the object and the event. And the question is, what other modes of designing are possible? And how do we begin to invent, and not necessarily invent, but at least engage them? Because I would argue that one of the failings of design over the past 60 years is that it has only thought about business and industry and capitalism in one way. It has been only when we think about, and this is why, this is an unpopular thing to say, but this is why social entrepreneurship is so popular with designers, right? This is why social entrepreneurship and design thinking appears on the front page of Harvard Business Review. Because social entrepreneurship primarily actually doesn't ask designers to think any differently. What it does is it says, look, capitalism in the market as it works, as you know it, is a way for you to affect social change. You don't have to take an ideological stance. Right? You can just engage in this pathway called social entrepreneurship and produce something new that's of social value. But what other ways are possible? And so one of the things that we've been looking at and have been very influenced by is the work of Gibson-Graham and ideas of post-capitalism and the ideas of beginning to think about what are all of the ways in which capitalism exists in society? One of the ways that we often don't talk about. Right? So this is one of the diagrams that's used in their community economies work. Right? So what are the ways in which these become spaces in which we might invent and do work differently? It's not that it's toppling markets, right? We may choose to topple markets, and we can talk about that, right? But this is about saying, no, that there are actually different kinds of markets. There are different modes of capitalism. There are other different spaces in which we might be doing the work that we're doing. How do we begin to shift? Right? What are the modes of, if part of the tension is this tension with business and capitalism, what are the other modes of business and capitalism that designers might act within? And I would say one of the things that designers need to do is to really engage this work. We actually don't need to reinvent it. There are others out there in other fields, like economic geography, that have spent decades doing that research that we can combine with, that we can join with in alliances to say, how do we bring design, whatever kind of design we want to do, to this new context? How do we begin to take the knowledge that's been produced about understanding all of the different ways in which we can think about this, that this is not a singular thing, that to design in each of these is not the same, that the inventive mode that we need to do is not actually to rethink markets, but to rethink design within these other markets that other people have articulated for us, that we can work together to do that. So, I mean, we've been looking at various examples of that. One of the things that I'm very involved in is working with alternative modes of food production. So, for example, one of the modes that actually gets brought up in some of the community economies work is the idea of foraging. This is a group of people in Atlanta that are picking fruit from a public fruit tree that will then be distributed to food shelters and women's shelters around the city. So this idea about how do you think about food systems that operate in parallel to existing food systems. And this is one way we can ask, how do I work as a designer in this context? What does it mean to work and a designer in support of these kinds of practices. And I would argue it changes. It's no longer the client-designer relationship. It fundamentally changes. But it's not only just working with others, it's also working as a designer. And increasingly what we see is new models of design. So Sassafras is a collective that we've been watching out of Michigan that is a workers collective, a worker-owned and operated collective, interaction design and technology development, that is actually rethinking what it means to have a design studio, and is part of a network of similar design studios and technology development around the States that's saying, what are the other ways in which we can organize our own business of design? Not just how do we reorganize the business and the markets and the labor that's happening outside of design, but taking a harsh reflective look and saying, what's our own practices, and how do we reinvent those practices, and what would it mean to have different kinds of collectives and cooperatives. And this gets to some of the discussion that happened yesterday around freelancers and saying, what are other ways that we might organize our own work? And one of the things that's notable about the folks from Sassafras is that, and many of these, is that they walk a line between being academics, many of them have come out of academic settings, and designers and activists. So in fact, you see the two folks who started Sassafras Design as also publishing manifestos of sorts. Right? So it becomes this kind of work in which they're doing, and in their case, publishing them back into technology, newsletters and things like that to say, here's how we rethink actually what it means to do this. We're going to create a new model of doing the work, and we're also going to take it upon ourselves to begin to promote this back as a discourse into the community. So one thing we have to do as designers is ask the question, what other modes are possible? The second thing we have to do is ask the question, how do we design for, with, and in hybrid ecologies? So this gets us back to one of the 5 themes before about thinking what's the character of the social. It gets us back to questioning the ways in which folks like Papanek and others have characterized this as a primarily human ecology, and to begin to think much more broadly about the ways in which we might design for what we could call hybrid ecologies. And there's a number of ways that I think we can go through this. So one, and in some ways one of the most obvious, is to really begin thinking about how do we design for non-humans. And in the field of architecture, you have this idea of animal architecture, and Ants of the Prairie is a studio that has done this, and there's a project, you see it in the upper right-hand corner there, called Bat Pods. And what's interesting to me about the work from Ants of the Prairie is that the idea is, how do we live with pests? How do we create structures and environments that allow us to live together with these animals that we have historically, we call them pests. Like we by definition, we don't want them around. So how do we begin to design environments that might say, okay, we commonly think of bats as a pest. How do we integrate, using design, bats back into our environment? And while I think this is actually beautiful and fascinating work, it's also the right first step, right? It's doing design as we would expect it to do. It's leveraging classic notions of form in terms of beautiful shape and volume, and integrating it back into the environment and saying, we're going to practice architecture kind of as we know it, but we're going to expand the realm of those who might inhabit the spaces that we design. So another way to look at this is the work of Åsa Stahl and Christina Lindström, who are doing a series of walks that begin to examine the ways in which plastics and biological materials form together. And this is an ongoing project. You can look it up on their website now, Hybrid Matters, and they're doing a postdoc around this. And it's an absolutely fantastic project in which these walks are structured to have us engage in the environment and trying to discover these new plastic conglomerates. And what I would argue is actually happening here is that, again, this is a notion of asking this question, how do we live in these new hybrid ecologies? How do we design these experiences, these events that allow us to live in a world in which plastic and non-plastic are melding together into new sorts of materials? This isn't about non-human encounters and the idea of engaging animals. This is about, though, encountering new hybrids that we haven't done before and using design as a way to bring us into conversation with these new environments. How do we begin to think about movements like Black Lives Matter? How do we begin to think about them as movements that don't just include this, but that it also includes, again, the algorithms that underlie them? So Black Lives Matter is, as I said before, in large part constituted by Twitter. But Black Lives Matter has not actually shaped itself as a social movement that says, yes, we're going to hold hands with the algorithm to make it. But what would it mean to do that? What would it mean to actually approach the design or the use of design to support social movements that took seriously the capacities of the Facebook ranking algorithm as part of the strategy for developing your social movement? Recognizing that our actions on the streets are not just our actions alone, but are in part shaped by these. And there's actually an example, an interesting example. So this is an image that, from all places, comes from a report by the Department of Homeland Security in the US. And the Department of Homeland Security did a fascinating study called the Resilient Network that you can get online, and it's free. And what they did is they studied the relief efforts of Occupy Sandy. So Occupy Sandy was a relief effort born out of the Occupy movement after Hurricane Sandy struck New York. And Occupy Sandy brought together people to try to provide real-time services and relief to those in need in those communities. And one of the things that Occupy Sandy did, very astutely, was they actually leveraged existing social media systems to move money around the city and to get it to people in places where the federal emergency management was not able to get money and resources to people. And so what you see is Occupy Sandy is using these systems, right? Using these systems of Google, using these systems of social media, using things like wedding lists on Amazon and Target.com, using those sorts of things to get resources from one community to another. A way of actively understanding. What's fascinating to me about this is there was an active understanding of the ways in which these systems work as infrastructure and a way in which they could co-opt that infrastructure to actually provide relief services to those in need. And it shows the sort of complexity of the kinds of relationships that happen with a movement like Occupy and using these existing systems, and the kinds of negotiations that happen in terms of rethinking what is our relationship to capitalism, what is our relationship to these systems, how do we make use of them as design materials themselves. So the final question that I think we need to ask ourselves is, how do we engage scale and multiplicity? And in fact, I would argue that it's not really this word, that we use this word a lot, scale a lot, but it's not scale that's going to be the problem, it's multiplicity. And that we have a challenge in thinking about how to do this from an informed activist perspective, because we have to wrestle with terms like the multitude. But there is another kind of multiplicity showing up, and again, it's showing up in some of the work that we do, and it has to do with this notion of the Internet of Things. So in Chicago, they just received $3.1 million to install what they call the Array of Things, which is going to be a network of sensors that are going to be placed around the city to track various environmental conditions. And they're actually, to their credit, they're aware of what the fundamental question is. It's like, well, one of them is when and where will these nodes be installed? And the challenge, I would argue, for doing design in this space is to think about, how do you work with neighborhood groups to understand and have them understand the notion of what does it mean when we have 200 nodes placed around the city? How do we begin to think about this kind of multiplicity, and how do we create in this environment and what kinds of infrastructures do we want? And we begin to see activities like this. Right, so this is a new activity. This is sort of a bottom-up notion of creating infrastructure for the Internet of Things. The idea is how do we build a global crowdsourced Internet of Things data network? How do we create a network that, unlike this, is not managed by the city, is not IBM Smart Cities packaged, brought in, installed, set up to run, but in fact is an underlying network that is created by citizens or others for their use, to give them control over data. What does that look like? How does this become a design activity? And again, one of the reasons why I love this screenshot is because if you look in the upper right corner, it gets us back to the problem that we began with. So, how do we support this? What does it mean to have these grassroots structures, right? And yet to support them through these kinds of activities such as Kickstarter? But the challenge that's going to be before us with this notion of the array of things and the Internet of Things is just that there's like so much things, right? There's so many things. And the question of multitude, I think much more than the question of scale, the question of multiplicity is a question that we're going to have to wrestle with design. And when we really begin to think not even 200, but 2,000, what does it mean to have 2,000 sensors spread across the city of Atlanta? How do we begin to think at that scale? How do we begin to work with the neighborhood to think at that scale? How do we begin to create infrastructures that can work at that scale or allow us to intervene at that scale? Is a question that we have to wrestle with. So it's these three questions to me that are the ones that should be leading us as we engage in this activity of making the social. Constantly asking and trying to be inventive and answering what other modes are possible. How do we design for, with, and in hybrid ecologies? And how do we scale? How do we engage scale and multiplicity? I don't have an answer for any of that. I have one word that I want to end with, which again is a word that I have been thinking about, that is the word that was in the essay I sent around, which is the idea of prefiguration. So prefiguration is an idea that suggests that what we can do in politics is to imagine and instantiate versions of what we might want the future to be. And David Graeber has talked about this in relationship to the Occupy movement and to earlier notions of direct democracy. And that what's interesting to me about this term is to actually try to think about what the relationship is to prefiguration and prototype. Right? Because prototype is a term that we're all familiar with, or most of us who are designers are familiar with. And the prototype is this object that we make before the object, right? This object that we make before the product or service. To what extent should we be thinking about this idea of prefiguration, about the idea of how do we collaborate in the construction of new social and political possibilities in a way that gets us back to what I showed at the beginning, the parking day, that allows it to stay at the level of the prototype, that allows it to stay at the level of the contingent and the experimental, that allows us to use it as a space to imagine what answers to those questions might be. Because I would say we don't want to rush to answer them. And they may not even be questions that we're capable as designers of answering. But thinking about this idea of participating in the imagination and the structuring of experimental social and political spaces, that may be the way to think about moving forward in this endeavor of making the social. Thank you. Questions?
First, thank you very much. Very interesting lecture. Lots to unpack. Something from yesterday, I was thinking, kind of linking Pascal Heelan's lecture to yours, particularly. You had a very stimulating question to him. How would you position some of your statements, such as working within the market, dealing with technology, and unpacking how these technologies are developed and the kind of norms within, and using his 4-part grid, the separation of the market, domestic, civil, and peers. Would you agree that with some of his statements enlarging the civil, or would you see this as a rebalancing of that configuration?
Of those 4 models he presented, the one that I found perhaps most related to this is that final notion in which the civil takes seems to take more space. And I would agree with him that that notion of the civil or the civics cannot or should not be reduced to the state. That in part what we see, for example, in the Occupy Sandy movement is a notion in which a kind of civics is being performed in which there are parallel notions of civics that are happening. And this is one reason why I like the Gibson-Graham so much, because Gibson-Graham gives us this notion that there's capital writ large, or there's capitalism writ large. There's also all of these parallel markets, these community economies that are going on. And I would hazard to say that what you see in Occupy Sandy is an example of a similar model or approach to understanding civics, where the state is still there, right? FEMA at that point in time, which is Federal Emergency Management, is still trying to get resources to people in New York. But what's happening is that Occupy Sandy is stepping in and saying, here's where FEMA is working, here's where the state is working, here's where the state is not working, here's the existing infrastructures that exist, both in terms of the physical infrastructures of the city and the technical infrastructures of Google and Amazon, and here's how we're going to negotiate amongst them. So in that sense, it's that, to me, that's his 4th and final model that seems to most fit this. I don't know how much I'd... Now I'm trying to remember what the other... So it was market, civil, domestic, and what?
Peers.
Peers? Yeah, so I wouldn't have made that distinction. Like the peers distinction is I don't know how peers are not in those other 3. Would be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Go someone.
Yeah. You go from the same direction.
Okay. I was wondering, since you talked about this do-it-yourself in a critical way, at least in that paper, how do you think about do-it-yourself and open source and these sort of grassroots infrastructures versus the idea of hybrid ecologies as almost a bricolage practice of appropriating different technologies versus developing something ground up?
My answer to that is pragmatic more than theoretical, in that it's really hard, right, to develop anything ground up. This project is the right project to ask. I would be surprised if it succeeds, right? The idea of actually creating a global underlying technical infrastructure that's going to be robust in times of need, right? In times of actual crisis, that's difficult work to do. And that's why I think that I was trying to say, designers shouldn't be concerned with inventing all of this, right? We don't need to invent, for example, new markets per se. We need to understand the ways in which others have shown us what other markets might exist. So I think that the DIY movement can be fantastic, but I'm always reminded of a statement that open source is only free to those people whose time has no value. And I think that's a statement that's worth considering. I'm going to turn off this flashlight, so I'm not texting or something while you're doing it. I'm just trying to. Please go ahead and ask questions.
Yeah, I was interested in your when you were talking about these algorithms on Twitter.
Yep.
And the Occupy movement using the understanding of that kind of algorithms. Of course, these algorithms are also designed by someone.
Yep.
So my question was: one, are these the algorithms, are they known and are they transparent? And secondly, don't these algorithms very often answer to a kind of capitalist logic?
Yeah, totally.
So how does this work? How
Right.
can you, is your idea that these things should be subverted, should be turned around by using them in another sense?
Yes, so the answer to the second question is yes.
Okay.
The first question is, they are not only kept secret, even knowing them, it's almost, so I've heard, for example, that the Google algorithm is just almost unknowable at this point, right? It's like this sublime algorithm, right? When Tarleton Gillespie did his work on Twitter, he interviewed Twitter engineers, right? And he's interviewed Facebook engineers. And you will get, and people who are doing these sort of critical algorithm studies, you can get some access. And you can get some, there's no transparency, but you can get some insight into this. And so if you can look broadly, for example, at how does Facebook rank things? And there is a general sense of what the big parts of that algorithm are. But it's not made transparent to us. It is a fascinating question of policy and regulation, if it should be made transparent to us, right? And particularly as these things become governing, right? In the same way that we should understand how an electronic voting machine tallies the votes, right? I would argue we should be able to understand how Facebook uses an algorithm to sway moods. It's even more complicated, I think, in that not only is it not transparent, but as we've seen from social science research over the past couple of years, social scientists working at places like Facebook can perform experiments in which those algorithms are tweaked in real time. So how it's working today may not be how it's working tomorrow. Which is why, though, as designers, I would say, in the same way, I mean, this is a really reductive example, but I think it works. In the same way that we need to understand how injection molded plastic works, right? How you get that wood to take that shape, to be a chair that you can sit on, we need to actually understand algorithms as a kind of materiality that gets worked with. That leads to your second question, which I would say, yes, I don't think it's so much about subverting the algorithm. I don't think that this is a case of subverting this system. It is a case of appropriating it and using it towards other ends. And I say that because I really to me, I get things are so messy. That's also why I like this. Things are so messy that it's hard to talk about whether or not, I mean, at this moment, Occupy is not subverting Amazon. They're in fact using Amazon to achieve some other goal. In the process of using Amazon, they're actually giving Amazon money, right? Amazon's taking some cut of all of this. So it seems like it would be hard, like they're not really subverting it, but they are using it towards their own ends. And I think that coming to that understanding, again, as a kind of materiality, as a kind of substance that can be rendered by design, is important.
Question about that also. I'm just wondering to what extent you should be actually actively engaged in the making of the algorithms as a designer, but also as citizens, to what extent, because what you mentioned about this active understanding, which by the way OpenStreetMaps I think is also very interesting. To what extent do you actually want people to be involved in the making of it? And not only the understanding of how it works, but also to be able to create alternative systems.
Very much so. And I think that, and very much so, it's not my own design endeavor, but having questions about how do you have public engagement in the same way that we've had public engagement with science, right? How do you have some sort of public engagement with, let's say, computation? public engagement with science that was also a good model because science continues to do what science is going to do regardless of the fact that there's public engagement. So building capacity and building literacy, I think, is crucial. It's interesting to note at the same time, I think it's right now, or if it's not right now, it's tomorrow and Friday, at the New School in New York is a 2-day conference called Platform Cooperatism, which is a conference that's looking at people who are trying to create, how do we create our own social networks? How do we do things like create our own workers' cooperatives? And really looking at that as a movement in which design can be involved, to me is an exciting thing to do. At the same time, I think we have to negotiate it. And this is why I'm really trying to speak about this from a design perspective. If you think about other materialities, right? We designers are trained to understand certain qualities of material and then certain qualities not, right? At a certain point, if you are building a building, if you're an architect, right, you have you may design a staircase, right? But then you may also hire an engineer to make sure that that staircase doesn't fall down. And so we don't know yet what those boundaries are for design and things like algorithms, but that's something we should be pushing at. What do you want me or you or someone else to be responsible for? And at what point do you want to actually bring in someone else who makes sure that the plane doesn't drop out of the sky? Pelle, you had a question and then...
It goes along the same lines. So maybe we could stay with the Sandy case.
Yeah.
And I don't know, so in our engagement with algorithms, are you suggesting that it's now so complex, so opaque that all we can do is to tap into and do reworks of things that already exist, like piggybacking on Amazon's waiting list, or is it also and so what is the, if, as has been suggested earlier, that these algorithms, the reason to believe that they are the way they are because they work in a capitalist market economy. So what does it happen to piggyback on them and tweet them and so on? And are there and this collective in Chicago, is that all they can do, or can they do something different based on their? So that's and I think you've partly answered this question. But then, and I think you've also reported on that. One of the in this report about Occupy Sandy from the New York authorities, they lift up Occupy Sandy as a good way for citizens, for public engagement in situations of crisis. But with the consequence that the city of New York do not have to spend so much resources on this, because this would be taken over by free labor. And so is this part of the algorithm as well?
Yeah, so I think, let me try to answer this question backwards. Is this part of the algorithm as well? Yes, I mean it's part of the larger algorithm as well. And it is, this is why I asked some of the questions yesterday, this is why I'm very upfront about this, where it is messy, and I don't know how to resolve it. It is precisely the situation that you described, where when the Department of Homeland Security lifts this up and says, yes, look, parallel civics, this is great. How do we respond to that? Because it is the state separating itself from the responsibilities that we would expect the state to have, which is to provide for residents in a time of crisis. And so, is this an ideal model? Maybe this is getting into your question as well. This is my issue with that model. Is this an ideal model of the civic? No. In my opinion, absolutely not. Right? But it's a model of the civic that works when there's a weak state. And that's the question to me that I think is so given that context, in some ways it is just incorporated right into the sort of the way neoliberalism works, right? DHS, Department of Homeland Security, says, this is an amazing thing, we can capitalize on this. Next time there's a hurricane, we just need to mobilize the Occupy movement, right? Like the fact that the Department of Homeland Security is saying that's our response, right? At the same time, I think it is worth noting, this is a civics that works in a weak state. It is interesting in that it is a civics that was constructed, in the absence, right, without the involvement of the state. It's a similar set of critiques that begins to happen around some of the post-capitalism stuff, and you say, yeah, farmers markets are great, and then you have neighborhoods that say, well, we don't need to put a grocery store in the neighborhood, it's fine for it to maintain itself as a food desert because the community is actually putting farmers markets in there. And so this is, I mean, I'm standing up here stumbling because I think this is actually the thing that we have to wrestle with, which is, given the totality of these systems right now, how do we operate within them? As for the algorithm, yes, I think that we can, there's two approaches. I think that there is an approach that says we should be actively involved in building these systems. So even though I think this will not succeed, I think it is the right thing to do. I think it is more the right thing to do than the Sassafras Collective, right? Which is just trying to work in another way. I think this is trying to fundamentally say, how do we build different infrastructure? Not all of us are going to do that. So it seems that there's two approaches. One is to be involved in trying to build this new infrastructure, be involved in trying to rethink what the different algorithm might be. And then another is to say, how do I appropriate this existing system for a new purpose, right? In similar ways to when you talked about the youth using the barcode scanners and the food to make hip-hop music in the grocery store in Sweden to make visible, right, to use that infrastructure to make visible the standing of immigrants. I think you could think about using algorithms in a similar way. How do you make Black Lives Matter visible in another way by understanding how algorithms work and tweaking its spread?
My question would be, would it be a solution to, for example, to say we must educate in future times social hackers?
Sure. But hacking, and I've written on this too, I mean, and I'm a colleague of mine, I mean, hacking is another one of those things. I was doing research on civic hacking for a while, and one of the reasons that I got really disillusioned with it is because it is like the Hurricane Sandy example. This movement around civic hacking is existing because the state is weak, and so the state says, look, we're actually not going to provide you with the resources that you need, right? So what we want you to do is to volunteer your time on a weekend to create apps for us, right? And that's a problem. So yes, social hacking, and I think social hacking in a long-standing traditional way of the manipulation of social structures, right, is definitely something that we should be thinking about. You know, you could put a big pile of things that we should be thinking about, things like social hacking and reconfiguration, things like repair, these sorts of things. But again, to me, all of that, if you go back to all of that, again, points to that shift away from the early motivations to create new products and services towards instead thinking about relations and processes, right? So what is it that we're learning how to do? We're learning how to manipulate a process or to stage a process. We're not necessarily learning how to make a better radio or a more easy to drink out of cup, right? Which is a shift in what design has thought about. Yes.
I wanted to ask, this project also questioned the fact of the ownership of data, because in many cases, I think that's really problematic. Also in the case of algorithm, of course, start from a hidden exchange where things are not for free, but they are in exchange for your data. That sort of hidden text. And I think for how I see it, this is for me fundamental. just too are fast, then like there's this project, for example, question that about creating an Internet of Things, that then the data ownership of the information produced are like who's owning them, who's using them.
Yeah, so the idea with this is that it would be, the data that would be produced for this would be open. Right? And that's an important question that's coming up, for example, in this project, because, so Chicago actually has a fairly good open data policy already for its civic data, but the question that's being asked is, what does that mean to have open data for all of these sensors? And it's actually a fraught policy question, because on the one hand, people are saying, yeah, you should open it up right away. On the other hand, people are saying, we don't actually know what sort of inferences you're going to be able to get if you have sound levels spaced throughout the city. And so you run into this, you know, I think that open data becomes this interesting challenge where openness is not always a good thing. And the example I will give is the way that data is often manipulated in the real estate market, right? So when you make certain real estate data open, or when you make certain data about cities open, what we've found is that that often then gets manipulated to sort of redefine certain neighborhoods. And so now you can use a tool like Zillow or one of these other open, you know, real estate search things, and they're able to gather all of this data and suddenly present images of a neighborhood that may or may not be accurate. Right? So I think that those are some of the tensions that exist. But certainly that project is asking that question, and I think it's the right question to say. So who owns all of that data when there's a sensor on my light pole? Or for that matter, if I go for a run through the city tomorrow and I'm wearing my Nike armband, right? Like what happens, like who, Nike actually owns that data, but like what does that mean that Nike owns that data? What might it get used for? I think we're struggling with that.
Yeah, also because I think it relates back to your question, like should the algorithm of Facebook be open? But then again, if it's accessible, then you know that there will be some people ready to use it.
Right.
Also for other scope. And people will maybe use it for social engagement. And it's the same with the algorithm for high-speed trading. It was the same topic. And yeah, I think also, I think it's also, like, should we learn to about this algorithm? Then it's also a question like, what's the accessibility in general, overall of the general public of the information? What happened when we start to reason in terms of algorithms and public?
And my answer is yes, we should learn about it. And again, I would point to your earlier materialities and you know, the ways in which we have studied how space gets constructed. How if you have you know, those funny films from the 50s that were about people moving chairs, right, in public spaces, and so how do we take that same approach to understanding the ways in which these algorithms are shaping or might give the possibility to shape action? Yeah, I think that is one of the things that we should be thinking about, because they already are. I mean, they already are shaping action. The fact that, you know, you can have an image that is able to be circulated that actually ends up causing the kinds of backlashes that it does through something like Black Lives Matter shows that algorithm and the ways in which images circulate matter in important structures. Do you have a question? Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
This is the last question. So
Thank you. I'll make it count. I'll try. Going back to Occupy Sandy, I was thinking, of course, using those tools and using algorithms, also the way they are used in smart cities, lend themselves great in issues of resilience.
Yep.
But what about actual long-term social change? How do you think pattern recognition or all these kind of algorithms work in that kind of context? Not about something that changes dynamically and real time and you can affect them, but things that take time, longer processes. How do you think that works in a context?
So my answer to that would be purely speculative, because we don't know yet. But I'll give you two answers. Either one they're not going to. One, they're not going to, because what we're going to find is that all of this is, that social media as we know it is going to crumble. That could happen. It's unlikely, but it could happen. Or it could be something that it is so temporary, right, that the algorithms don't actually have the lasting effect that other kinds of infrastructure does. So if you think about this, no one talks about Friendster, right? Or very few people talk about MySpace, right? Or what are all of these other things that, right? The other way to think about it is that the algorithms, and again, this is a reductive metaphor, but I'm going to run with it, that algorithms they're the highways, they're the infrastructure of the 21st century, and so that they will shape things in the same way that you have algorithms that cut through, or you have highways that cut through cities, you have highways that define where cities are placed, right? Because whether or not there's a highway there and things like that, that algorithms will function similarly, and that they will end up being these structures that we organize other activities around in the long term. And I think that that's a terrifying thought, right? To think that Mark Zuckerberg is somehow laying the structure around which we will organize for the next 200 years, but it's possible.
Maybe we can leave the rest
Thanks.
of the questions